Have you ever been told to do something that your heart quietly refused? Not out loud. Not in protest. Just a stillness that held your hand in place. In a world built on orders, what happens when silence is the only act of courage left? The desert was breathing that morning, slow, dry gusts whispering over dust-colored rooftops. He lay still, face down behind a crumbling wall, rifle braced, breath controlled. Through the scope, a door. A movement. Intel had been clear, this house had to be taken out. No questions asked. He'd followed orders like this before. Same routine. Same silence. But something caught his eye. To the left of the doorway, just a flicker. A blur of color where there should have been only beige and gray. A child. Not running. Not hiding. Just sitting. Small arms wrapped around a faded teddy bear, legs dangling off the cracked steps. He blinked. Adjusted the focus. Looked again. She was real. And for a long moment, he forgot he was holding a weapon. The radio crackled in his ear, "Sniper ready?" He didn't answer. Finger hovering over the trigger, his body was still trained, still prepared. But his mind, his heart, had already stepped back. Because this wasn't about hesitation. It was about something deeper. Something no one would hear. Something no one would see. Except him. And the girl. His name was Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke. 43 years old. 2 decades in uniform, most of them spent in places people couldn't pronounce and didn't want to remember. He wasn't the loudest in the room. Never had to be. People listened when he did speak, because he chose his words like he chose his shots, carefully, deliberately. That morning, Daniel had done everything by the book. Checked his wind. Lined up the distance. Ran the math in his head, the way only experienced snipers do. His breathing was calm. His eyes were clear. But behind that stillness, something had shifted. Daniel wasn't just staring through glass and crosshairs. He was watching a decision unfold in real time. And for the first time in a long time, the rules in his head and the voice in his gut weren't saying the same thing. A voice broke through his earpiece again, sharp, commanding. "Rourke, you copy? You have green light." He didn't move. Didn't speak. The man who'd followed orders without hesitation now found himself frozen by a presence that didn't fit any mission brief. A little girl, barely older than his niece back home, now quietly sitting within the blast radius. He whispered, maybe to himself. "I see her." "What?" the voice barked back. "I said, there's a child." Silence. Then, "Do you have visual confirmation on the target?" "I do." "Then execute, Sergeant." His hand didn't twitch. His finger never moved. Because Daniel Rourke wasn't thinking about tactics anymore. He was thinking about aftermath. About a small, empty pair of shoes that might be left behind. About the kind of silence that doesn't fade after the sound of gunfire ends. And in that moment, the man behind the scope wasn't just a soldier. He was something else entirely. The radio clicked again. The voice on the other end was firmer now, laced with urgency. It belonged to Lieutenant McAdams, a younger man, by the book, sharp-edged, never questioned the chain of command. "Sergeant Rourke, confirm visual on target. We have clearance. Execute." Daniel kept his eyes on the house. The child was still there, still unmoving. His breathing had changed, not fast, but heavier, like his chest had started carrying something more than just his gear. He pressed his hand to the radio. His voice was low. "There's a civilian present. Female child. Close proximity to the entry." McAdams didn't pause. "Negative, Sergeant. Target is confirmed hostile. You have clearance. Take the shot." Daniel didn't respond. He adjusted his position slightly, not to aim, just to see. To be sure. The child was near the threshold, within 5 feet. Too close. One shot, one detonation, and the world around her would disappear. His finger rested near the trigger guard, but never slipped inside it. McAdams came back louder. "Rourke, this is not a debate. You are ordered to eliminate the target. Do you copy?" Still, Daniel said nothing. A fly buzzed near his cheek, landed on his scope, and flew off. He blinked slowly. He wasn't hesitating. He was deciding. In the military, there's a difference. He pressed the button. "I copy, sir." "Then execute." Daniel's fingers stayed still. Seconds passed. The radio hissed. "What's the delay, Rourke?" His voice came back steady, almost too calm. "Target compromised. Civilian in line of fire. I'm standing by." "You are not authorized to stand by." "I understand. You're disobeying a direct order, Sergeant." There it was. The sentence that changes everything. Not a suggestion. Not a correction. A formal accusation, spoken into the air, into the record. From that moment, there was no going back. Daniel took one last look through the scope. The little girl shifted slightly, hugging the stuffed bear closer to her chest. The front door remained shut. No movement. No weapons. Just dust and a quiet waiting. He reached up, detached his eye from the scope, and let the rifle rest across his chest. "I'm not pulling the trigger," he said. Silence. Then McAdams again, colder now. "Acknowledged. Hold your position. This will be reported." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't explain. There were no grand speeches, no heroic defiance. Just a man lying in the heat, choosing not to end a life. And that choice would follow him farther than any bullet ever could. The hearing was held in a small room on base. No cameras. No press. Just a few rows of folding chairs, a long table, and the weight of silence that never seemed to lift. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke sat at one end, uniform pressed, boots clean, eyes steady. On the table in front of him sat a single manila folder. Inside it, the report, the transcript, the accusation. Disobeying a direct order during combat operations. The charge itself didn't fill the room. But the question behind it did. A panel of 3 officers sat across from him, flanked by a legal advisor and a note-taker. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a fist. It wasn't that kind of trial. It was colder than that, formal, surgical. Almost polite. Lieutenant McAdams sat as witness. His voice was clipped and professional, eyes fixed forward. "I issued the command 3 times. Sergeant Rourke acknowledged each time. He failed to act." One of the panel members asked calmly, "Were there any confirmed hostiles inside the building?" "No visual confirmation. Intelligence indicated activity consistent with prior enemy use." The legal officer turned to Daniel. "Staff Sergeant Rourke, did you disobey a lawful order?" Daniel took a breath. He didn't flinch. Didn't look away. "I did not carry out the order, sir." "Why?" "There was a child in the area of the target. I couldn't confirm she would be clear." "That's not the question. Why did you disobey the order?" Daniel paused again, but only for a second. His voice stayed calm, quiet. "Because I couldn't justify the risk." The room sat still for a long moment. The panel member leaned forward. "Sergeant, you understand the implications of your decision. Inaction under fire can compromise the entire unit. This was a mission-critical operation. Do you regret your choice?" Daniel looked at them, not defiant, not ashamed. Just honest. "I regret that we were in that position. But no, sir. I don't regret not pulling the trigger." They wrote that down. Every word. Filed it away next to the rest of his career, commendations, tours, letters of praise. It would all be weighed now, against one moment of silence. The panel didn't reach a full conviction. They called it operational hesitation, not insubordination. But it was enough to end the field career of a decorated sniper. He was reassigned to administrative duty within the month. No formal reprimand. No stripes taken. Just a quiet redirection, a desk, a badge, a new nameplate on a door far from the field. Later that day, McAdams passed him in the hallway. Neither man spoke at first. Then the lieutenant turned and said, flatly, "You made it harder for all of us out there." Daniel didn't blink. Maybe. But maybe that little girl gets to grow up. McAdams didn't answer. He just walked away. And Daniel stood there a moment longer, listening to the echo of his own words. Not triumphant. Not certain. Just a man who made a call. And would carry it alone. Daniel Rourke didn't leave the army with a dishonorable discharge. He didn't lose his rank. But in the quiet way the military handles things it doesn't quite know how to label, he was placed behind a desk, tucked into a logistics office stateside, and never asked to pick up a rifle again. He never said much about it. His co-workers knew he'd served. A few knew he'd been a sniper. But most saw him as the quiet older guy who double-checked inventory and always left the office right on time. The kind who stood when the flag was raised and stayed silent during the anthem, eyes fixed on something far away. At night, he'd walk the same route home. Through the edge of town, past the elementary school, the quiet park, the diner with the always flickering neon light. He lived alone in a small one-bedroom on the second floor of an old red brick building. No medals on the wall. No pictures in uniform. Just one framed photo on the table, his niece, maybe 6 years old, beaming with missing teeth and pigtails. Sometimes, when he passed the playground, he'd stop. Not for long. Just enough to hear the laughter, the footsteps, the sound of life that carried farther in the cool evening air. It didn't haunt him. But it stayed with him, like a song you don't forget even after the music fades. One day, an old friend from his unit visited. A man named Keenan, rough, funny, the kind of guy who wore his stories loud. They met for coffee, sat on a bench outside the cafe, and let the steam rise from their cups without rushing into conversation. "You ever wonder," Keenan said, "if we did too much?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched a mother cross the street with her child, holding hands, the girl skipping in mismatched shoes. "I wonder," Daniel said, "if maybe we didn't do enough." Keenan raised an eyebrow. "You did what you had to." "No," Daniel said quietly. "I did what I could live with." That was the difference. It wasn't about orders anymore. Or outcomes. It was about living with the weight of a choice no one else had to carry. Some men come home with medals. Others with memories. And some, like Daniel, carry something quieter. The weight of not pulling the trigger. The weight of knowing that silence can echo louder than a gunshot. He never spoke much about that day. But those who knew him sensed something different. Not broken. Not bitter. Just a stillness in him that hadn't always been there. As if he were listening for something. Or remembering the sound of a voice he chose never to silence. There was a drawer in Daniel Rourke's apartment he rarely opened. Bottom left. Slightly warped from humidity. Inside were a few old envelopes, most of them blank, some addressed but never mailed. One had been written on lined paper, folded cleanly, placed inside without a stamp. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Not rushed. The kind of writing that comes when each word carries weight. He had written it a few weeks after the trial, on a quiet Sunday evening, just after sunset. No music. No TV. Just the sound of his pen and the ticking clock on the wall. He started with no name. "I don't know who you are, or where you are now. I don't even know if you made it out that day. But I saw you. And I need you to know that." He'd written slowly, trying to find the right words. Not military words. Not tactical reports or situational breakdowns. Just human ones. "You were sitting in the doorway of that house, holding a bear with a missing ear. You didn't scream. You didn't run. You just watched the world from that spot like you'd been there for hours. Like you didn't expect anyone to notice. I noticed. He paused then, for a long while. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew too much, and didn't know how to fit it into a page. People think silence means weakness. That if you don't act, you're afraid. But sometimes silence is the strongest thing we have. Sometimes it means choosing something that no one else can see. And sometimes, it means carrying something forever, just so someone else doesn't have to. He hadn't signed the letter. He wasn't sure if it was meant to be sent. Part of him thought it never would be. But writing it was the only thing that helped him breathe that night. Weeks passed, then months. The letter stayed in the drawer. Occasionally, he would reread it. Never aloud. Just quietly, eyes moving line by line, like checking the sight on a rifle, steady, focused, careful. Keenan once found him sitting alone at the diner with the letter in his hand. He didn't ask about it. Just glanced at the paper, then at Daniel. "You ever think about mailing it?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "I don't think it's meant for her," he said. "I think it's meant for me." And Keenan didn't press. Some letters aren't written to be delivered. They're written so the writer doesn't forget. So the story stays anchored. So the silence has somewhere to live. And for Daniel Rourke, that drawer, quiet, unmarked, almost forgotten, held the only mission he'd ever finished without firing a single shot. Years later, Daniel Rourke received a letter from a local veterans group. They were hosting a quiet gathering at the community hall, just coffee, folding chairs, and a chance for younger service members to talk with those who'd served before. Not a ceremony. Not a speech. Just presence. He almost didn't go. The letter sat on his table for days, unopened, until one morning he read it over black coffee and something in him stirred, not obligation, but curiosity. Maybe they weren't looking for medals or war stories. Maybe they were just looking for someone to listen. So that Saturday, Daniel put on his old service jacket. No decorations, no pins. Just the same patch on the shoulder he'd worn when he chose not to pull the trigger. He walked the few blocks to the hall under a gray sky, wind gently pushing the autumn leaves along the pavement. Inside, the room was simple. Folding chairs in a loose circle. Coffee percolating in the back. A few younger faces, early 20s, in jeans and boots. One or two older vets leaned back with arms crossed, quietly taking in the room. Daniel nodded to no one in particular and took a seat. They started slow. Introductions. Branch. Years of service. Some joked. Some kept it short. Then a young man named Harris spoke. Infantry. One deployment. He looked nervous, hands clasped too tightly. "I had a situation once," Harris said, voice low. "We were told to clear a building. Intel said it was clean, just routine. But something felt wrong. I hesitated. Just for a moment. No one interrupted. They found civilians inside. A family. I don't think I'll ever forget the kid's face. I was seconds away from," he stopped. Swallowed. "Anyway. Sometimes I wonder if I messed up." Daniel looked at him. The room was still. And then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "You didn't mess up," Daniel said. "You made a call. That's what we're asked to do out there. Not just follow. Decide." Harris looked up, surprised. "Even if it goes against orders?" Daniel paused. Then answered with care. "Orders are what keep the machine moving. But you're not a machine. You're a man. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is not act. Even when everyone's telling you to." The room stayed quiet. But something shifted. Heads nodded. Shoulders relaxed. No applause. No agreement required. Just understanding. Afterward, one of the coordinators came up, offering thanks. "You should come speak more often. These guys could use someone who's lived through the quiet side of service. Daniel shook his head gently. I'm not much of a speaker, he said. But I can sit. I can listen. He stayed until the coffee went cold. Then walked home through the slow dusk, the wind brushing past his face. He hadn't said much. But sometimes presence says more than words. And in that quiet room, without medals or speeches, Daniel Rourke reminded them all of something most people forget. That some battles aren't fought with bullets. And some heroes never raise their voices. Daniel Rourke kept a small wooden box on the shelf above his desk. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden. Just quietly there, gathering dust beside a stack of folded flags and a book of poetry he never finished reading. Inside the box were a few keepsakes. A compass. A worn photograph of his squad. And at the bottom, tucked beneath a piece of folded cloth, was a single bullet. It wasn't marked. It had never been chambered. Just one round, clean and used. He'd found it the day after his last deployment, resting loose in a gear bag. Most would have tossed it or turned it in with the rest. But Daniel kept it. Not as a trophy. Not as a symbol of war. But as a reminder of the shot he never took. Sometimes, when the evenings grew long and the light turned amber through his windows, he'd sit at the desk, open the box, and hold the bullet in his hand. He never stared at it for long. Just enough to feel its weight. It wasn't heavy in the physical sense. But it carried something larger. A choice. A moment. A life that may have gone on quietly because of silence. Years had passed. The girl's name was still unknown. He never tried to find her. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about resolution. It was about memory. One evening, his niece asked him why he didn't have any medals on display like other veterans she'd seen. Daniel smiled gently and said, "Not every story ends with a medal. Some just end with peace." And she didn't ask again. That night, after she'd gone to bed, he sat at his desk one last time. Picked up the bullet. Set it down on a velvet cloth. Then closed the box. The world wouldn't remember Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke for his silence. But maybe somewhere, someone lived because of it. And maybe, that was enough. Sometimes, courage doesn't come with applause or medals, it comes in the form of restraint. Through the quiet life of Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke, we're reminded that true heroism isn't always about action. It's about discernment. About choosing humanity over habit, even when it costs you your career, your recognition, your place. Daniel didn't pull the trigger, and because of that one silent decision, a child may have lived. He carried that choice not with regret, but with dignity, a weight heavier than any bullet. In a world that often praises force over thought, his story invites us to rethink what it means to serve, and what it means to lead with conscience. If you've ever made a hard decision in silence, one no one saw or celebrated, Daniel's story is for you. Do you believe that not acting can sometimes be the bravest choice of all? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because there are more quiet heroes out there, and their voices deserve to be heard, one story at a time.